Why you over Senator Lugar?
Simply stated, because I think we're at a point where we need a more conservative view representing Indiana. I say it in every one of these occasions. Mr. Lugar's delivered long, notorious service, but I do believe in the second decade of the 21st century, the time is such that we need a more conservative point of view to start to deal with the problems we have, which are enormous.
What are those problems?
Well, let's start with the national debt of over $15.3 trillion. How is Michael Mullen, former head of the Army Joint Chiefs of Staff, said it is the biggest threat to our national defense, not Al-Qaeda, not nukes in Iran, it's our own debt. And we've seen government grow and grow and grow, and the cost is getting greater and greater. It is clearly inhibiting our ability to have any kind of meaningful economic recovery. And we cannot separate our economic recovery from the overall national situation we have with our debt, and we need to break that cycle.
I listened to the debate, and a lot of the questions were very foreign policy issues, which plays to Senator Lugar. But if you were to win the seat, you wouldn't necessarily take his place on the committees. What committees what committees do you feel like you would want to serve on and feel like you could best serve the state and the nation?
Sure. My wife often says I'm a person cursed with many interests. I'm a geologist by training. Spent 31 years in the energy business, so certainly energy and commerce is some place I would like to be. With the time I've spent as state treasurer, and especially this dramatic time of seeing all the financial meltdown and watching everything that's happened with Dodd-Frank, banking and finance is an area that I find fascinating, and I know I could deliver some good service on. Here in Indiana, obviously we're a big ag state. My science background goes well to that. So all those things are out there that I would very much like to be involved with. And I don't, while there would probably be a fight a bit to replace Senator Lugar on foreign relations, and a new senator may not get it, I wouldn't be intimidated by that either. I had a lot of comments after the debate, how surprising it was that the state treasurer actually knew something about foreign policy. I was asked the day before the debate by one of the TV stations in Indianapolis, how much was I studying, getting ready for the debate and all that. And it was just it wasn't a thought out answer, just reflective. My answer was about 60 years. Because this is what I've always loved. It's just the broad brush of world events and broad brush politics, and we'd be ready to serve in any of those areas.
Richard, there's a story breaking today about your campaign and the Republican database on voters. Apparently, one of your people sent out an email that said pillaged the list. It was more colorful than that.
Yeah, that's pretty close though, yeah.
What?
Here's the story. We had no access to it. We never had access to it. They're trying to say we've had access to it. We've never had access to it, and we've never had access to it. It's amazing to me. It's obviously a story being ginned up by Mr. Lugar's camp. And it is, especially given the other news of yesterday, I don't think this was coincidence at all, that shortly after we released our latest polling, which showed for the first time we've taken the lead in this race, they had to get something out in the news. And all of a sudden they put that story out there, and it is on a par with, let's see, Richard Mourdock wears Confederate neckties, and Richard Mourdock dyes his hair. Any number of stories they've been putting out there for weeks. And by the way, I don't dye my hair, and I don't have Confederate neckties.
Who said you dye your hair?
Oh, their committee's been putting that out. They put out website things, and they put out Facebooks. And every time I'm on TV, apparently my hair looks darker on TV, but they always put out that I dye my hair. And I've learned this one just over the weekend. For all these things they put out too on Facebook, that Mourdock wears Confederate neckties. Someone finally asked me where I got them. I got them at the Republican State Convention a couple years ago, and they are not Confederate neckties. They are simply a red tie with a blue star or blue stripe and white stars. And they found video of Senator Lugar wearing exactly the same necktie. So,
well, was there an email that said pillage?
Yeah, there was, and it was a stupid email that.
What was that about? Why did he do that?
Why did he do it?
Why did he send that email out? Yeah.
Because there's been a long practice of campaigns using state data, which again we didn't have access to. And there are several state databases, but the one they're talking about is one called Salesforce, which is where donors are listed. We've not had access. And there's been a long pattern, unfortunately, of campaigns that get access to that, pull emails out of it, and then go for donations. And what you didn't see in one email was in the full context of the jokes beforehand in the preceding emails and preceding conversations. I guess more specifically, I was not involved with them, so I'm reporting this secondhand. But just about how they were all joking about, yeah, everybody's doing that, everybody's doing it. And yet it's, I think, a moot point in the sense that there was never access provided to us to that database. We've never been in that database. You know, I understand, even as I was driving here today, that apparently someone in Indianapolis is saying we did this and that, and it's totally wrong, because we've never had access to the database, and we challenge anyone to go talk to the people in state committee, and they'll verify we never had access to the database, to Salesforce, which is what this is.
Well, that's the thing, that the state committee says they don't want to talk about it, they would handle it in-house.
Yeah, right.
But, okay, so you're saying when Jim Holden wrote, we have a Salesforce login again, that was not true?
That it was not true. It was put in place.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a contract signed. We sent the contract off, as I understand it. This was in the middle of March. But before the contract was acted on by state committee to issue any kind of passwords or access codes, apparently Jim sent what he thought was going to be a humorous email, hit return or reply all instead of to the people he intended to, and went to state committee, and state committee said, we'll stop right here. We're not doing anything further.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you said that this is out of context, and in context it would be clear that this is a humorous email?
That's my feeling of it, and I've been away from Indy, so I haven't seen the email, but that's what I've been told.
If that's the case, would you be willing to release that email?
I think the email is already out there.
Okay.
That
I don't know.
I think.
I
don't
haven't
know.
seen it, but I don't know.
Well, somebody's quoted the email, so it must be out there. Yeah.
I've heard you say that you would like, I think if I understood you correct, you understand the concept of compromise, and you're on board with that, but that you would like to see the Republican senator from Indiana put up more of a fight.
Mm-hmm.
Am I?
Yeah, let me say it in a way that sounds rather bombastic, but I want to put this in context too, and I'll do that after I say it. But you know, I've said it 100 times, for all the cries for bipartisanship, it is bipartisanship that's taken us to the brink of bankruptcy. We don't need bipartisanship as much as we need the application of principle. And what I mean by that, as a student, and I mean a serious student of American history, you can look through our history and you find any number of times when we've become very polarized in a political sense in this country. Obviously the Civil War was the worst of those. But there have been other times when it's happened. And as Lincoln said going into the Civil War, not quite knowing they were going into the Civil War when he said it, but the present agitation must continue until one side prevails. My point is, in making the fight, I believe in my marrow of my bones that the conservative points of view that call for limited government, greater individual responsibility, greater individual freedom are the right ones. And to implement those, Republicans, maybe more properly said, conservatives, need to control the House of Representatives, the United States Senate, and the White House. If we can do that as a party, it is paramount on us to make sure people start to understand what it is we are fighting for. You know, I'll be honest, I am more frustrated with Republicans than I am with Democrats. I understand who Democrats are, I'm not going to agree with them, that's fine. But what frustrates me is the Republicans who will go to DC, vote the right way most of the time, but then when they return to their districts, when they get on the talking head TV shows, they don't make the argument in front of a hostile crowd why what they did was the right thing to do for the long run or the short run for the country. You know, and I would also add, when it comes to bipartisanship, I don't remember a cry for bipartisanship during the Obamacare debate. There was not a single Republican voted for it, was there? It wasn't about bipartisanship, it was about the numbers and cramming through. And ironically, the Democrats, to make my point, the Democrats have handled that so badly, even though they jammed it through, they know it's been unpopular. So they haven't been back in their districts, they haven't been on TV making the argument why they think Obamacare is a good thing. And so it still has something like 70% of the people who are opposed to it. So this is a fault of both sides, or it's a flaw, I should say. But with the potential that we have of having conservatives in control of the Senate and the House, I think we have to use the opportunity to help bring the American public along.
So the party hasn't been assertive enough?
The individuals within the party have not been instructive enough. You know, I often use the example, Ronald Reagan through his entire 8 years, never had control of the Republicans, never had control of either the House or the Senate, but he got a lot done. How did he get it done? Because even when he was blocked by the national media, he found a way to go around to the media and deal directly with the American people. That's why they became what was known as Reagan Democrats. Because even though many Republicans viewed him as hostile, he got in front of them and he made the argument and he won them to his side. And sadly, we don't have, there are two Republicans, two that I can think of, in the last several years that have been pretty good about making the argument and getting in front of the crowds and taking the flack. One is Paul Ryan, who puts a health care plan out, and the next day he's videotaped, the famous pushing grandma over the cliff on a chair. And Mike Pence, who spent a lot of his time prior to beginning the run for governor, spent a lot of time on those talking head shows trying to make the argument as to why conservatism is the best thing for the country. And I just think that's something our party has done a horrible job doing, and I'd like to be active in trying to turn around.
Talk a little bit about why you hammered away so much about the residency issue with Lugar.
I didn't. Let's understand this. I never talk about the residency issue unless someone brings it up as a question. And let me parse words a minute. Let me explain.
You weren't in front of his house for a news conference or his former
Not
house?
to talk about residency. And this is where I want to parse words. Residency is about where he had the right to vote. I never got in that argument because I knew I was in an argument I would lose. I knew somehow the state of Indiana, because he's Dick Lugar, would find a way for him to vote. The argument that I've always made, Ryan, and what I made in front of his house with poster board things beside me, was his inhabitancy issue. It is the United States Constitution, not the law of Indiana, the U.S. Constitution that sets the requirement to be a United States Senator. Article 1, Section 3, there are only 3. Number 1, you must be over the age of 30. Mr. Lugar passes that test, as do I. Number 2, you have to have been a U.S. citizen for 9 years. And, most importantly, to the point, it says you must, when elected, be an inhabitant of that state. Inhabitant has nothing to do with voting. You can have a 15-year-old child who's never been outside the state of Indiana. They're an inhabitant, but they're not a voter. You can have somebody who's lived here 80 years and never registered to vote. They're an inhabitant, not a voter. Inhabitant means having a physical presence. And that's the argument I made. It's not residency.
Okay, why haven't you hammered away at the inhabitancy issue?
Because I think the Constitution of the United States should be relevant in the 21st century. The fact that Mr. Lugar thinks it doesn't matter, I find atrocious. That he would spend a lot of money hiring high-priced lawyers to say, you can't make me, you can't make me, you can't make me live in Indiana, I think is outrageous for someone who's supposed to represent Indiana. What's so bad with Indiana? I love the place. The argument, oh, well, gee, they never imagined when the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution, when they wrote those words, they never imagined a full-time Congress. True enough, but they also never imagined flying from D.C. to Indianapolis in an hour and 22 minutes. If the Congress thinks it's no longer relevant, then make a constitutional amendment, pass it, and let's change the Constitution.
Do you think it was not well known over the past few decades that he has not inhabited Indiana?
I'd say, yeah, empirically that's true. Most people didn't know that. I mean, the first time I ever heard it was, when did Jim, what was his name? Not Jim Johns. Or was it Jim Johns? Who ran against Lugar in 1994? Whoever that was made an issue of it then. That was the first I'd ever heard of it. But yeah, it was not widely known. Obviously, his campaign didn't get much traction at all. But and I'm not trying to be smart with you when I separate between residency and inhabitancy, but there are two different issues. And I never talk about residency because I said I knew I'd lose that. And sure enough, ultimately they said he couldn't vote from a house that he doesn't live in, that someone else lives in. So they changed it so now he can vote from a house that he doesn't live in, that somebody else lives in.
Do you think his lack of inhabitancy, in your view, do you think that affected his performance as a senator, however?
Absolutely.
Why so?
Because I think he's lost touch with the people he represents. I think Senator Lugar has more of a world view than he does a Hoosier view, especially a Hoosier Republican view. If he's going to represent, we're talking about a primary here, if he's going to represent the Republican primary voters, then he should have done a far better job in staying in contact. He logged off the Indiana server a long time ago. And that distance has really come back, I think, to haunt him here recently. And the very act of paying high-priced lawyers to make the argument say, you can't make me live there, even makes the point. I mean, I think most Hoosiers were openly offended by the fact that he was fighting so hard to say, you can't make me live there. What's wrong with Indiana? That shows he's out of touch.
Leaving aside, and could I at least get you to concede that in the mindset of the average voter, when you discuss whether he's an inhabitant versus whether he's a resident, that's a very nuanced,
Yeah, sure, I'll
subtle
agree with that.
point of view that's probably lost on the electorate. I think that the
I
greater
understand.
message that most of these people were receiving was, this guy just hasn't spent enough time here, he's out of touch with you, it's time to make a change. Is that fair, a fair summarization of what the message is?
Sure, I think that's accurate. We've been talking for a long time that he's out of touch, and that's, again, and let's talk who the electors are on May 8th. It is the Republican primary voters. The Republican primary voters are very upset with his support of liberal justices, with his support of amnesty, with his co-sponsorship of the DREAM Act, with various treaties he's been involved with, you know, the big picture things that he typically wants to talk about and may even see perhaps as his strengths within our party.
Right.
Those are not popular things, and they show that he's out of touch with our party.
Staying with this thread for a second, you know, you have a man who spends more than a decade out of the state. He lives, let's say he even votes in Virginia, and he's not serving Indiana. He's a lobbyist on K Street. I'm talking about Senator Dan Coates. Is he somehow more or less qualified, or is he every bit a legitimate a senator as Dick Lugar is? You know, applying the standard that we just discussed.
It's a fair question. You know, I think when Dan Coates decided to get back to Indiana and run for that office, I think he certainly went a lot further than Mr. Lugar physically in establishing the inhabitancy issue. So that takes that constitutional issue away. But just as in the case of May 8th, ultimately the voters decided on whatever the first Tuesday of May was 2 years ago that Mr. Coates was in touch enough that he wanted, or that they wanted him to represent at least 39%.
What do you think, though, personally? You know, aside leaving the voters out of it, I mean, if this is the standard that you want to apply to Senator Lugar and whether he's fit for, you know, to continue as a senator, what about a guy like Coates who's been away a decade, didn't even vote here?
Yeah, I'm not afraid to say, I think we're always best served when we have people who are living here, you know, of the people, by the people, for the people, inherently means among the people. So I think that's a good standard, and certainly one that I've expressed in my voting.
Okay.
You're saying he doesn't actually live here. That's what you mean by inhabitancy. It's not physically.
It means, I mean, the classic definition, we don't get our Websters or Funkin' Wagnalls, but typically inhabitancy talks about having a physical presence someplace. I mean, Dick Lugar has said to Candy Crowley on CNN, he maintains an address in Indiana, and I quote, for political purposes. That's certainly separating himself from that physical presence. When the question came up about his driver's license and he wasn't even sure which address was on his driver's license, sort of demonstrates that there wasn't that real physical connection. And I think that is an important constitutional. And by the way, let me make the point too. When we had that news conference in front of Sarah Hughes' home, that was before, and my point was, that day was to challenge Mr. Lugar to promise Republican voters that should he be selected in the primary, that before the general election, he would again become an inhabitant. So that, should he be elected in the fall, no one in the Senate beginning 1/113 could challenge his qualifications for office. That was before Olympia Snowe decided not to run for re-election. And that's significant because no one really thought there might be a 50-50 Senate. I was thinking it could happen. In this polarized environment, like we were talking about a few minutes ago on the issue of bipartisanship, if it's 50-50, do any of you in this room seriously think that Harry Reid wouldn't walk to the microphone after this and say, you know, Mr. Lugar, you said on Candy Crowley on CNN, you don't keep a physical presence in Indiana. It is there simply for a political address. You have not met the constitutional requirement. Therefore, we do not consider you qualified. And if we question whether or not we think Congress can do that, whether the Senate and the House can do it, all of us in this room, I think, probably all of us, remember 1984 in this district. Rick McIntyre, Frank McCloskey. McIntyre declared the winner, certified by the Indiana Secretary of State, sent to the U.S. House of Representatives, and refused a seat because the people running the House didn't like the way they counted votes, and they came in and did it themselves. They have the rules on their side. And when you have this partisan atmosphere that we have right now, and it's not a good thing, it does lead to those kind of decisions.
What do you think Joe Donnelly thinks of all this, the fight you're in now, the fight Senator Lugar's in, what kind of effect might this have come November, no matter who has the
Sure.
green check mark?
It's been fascinating to me, Tim, to watch the evolution of the Democratic Party in this issue since January of 2011. Now, let's go back then. Remember, 6 years ago, Lugar did not even have an opponent in the general election. When the rumor surfaced that I might be thinking of running, no, her name just went on my head, woman, former head of the Democratic Party in the state, on TV all the time.
I think you just stumped the press.
Oh, Ann Delaney. Ann Delaney. Okay, sorry. Ann Delaney put out a press release saying, if Mourdock runs against Lugar, every Democrat ought to pick up a Republican ballot to vote for Dick Lugar because he's the perfect senator. That was the former state Democratic chairman. Well, then all of a sudden Joe Donnelly shows up and says, wait a minute, they've redrawn my district. It's a written invitation to run for something else. So he gets involved. So now they kind of walk that back a little bit. But I'm sure Joe Donnelly is hoping that I win this election. And to that, I offer these words: be careful what you wish for. You know, in 2010, Joe Donnelly was on the ballot and I was running for re-election. State treasurer is very much a down ticket race. Joe Donnelly spent $2.2 million in his district running for re-election. I spent about $580,000 in all 9 districts in total to run in the state. I got 69,000 more votes in Joe Donnelly's district than Joe Donnelly got. And by the way, my opponent came from his district. And my opponent was the best funded of all the statewide Democrats. So, you know, I'm more than ready to run against Joe Donnelly. And by the way, his voting record is essentially a carbon copy. I keep thinking whatever the 21st century version of carbon copy is, it comes in date. It is essentially an absolute copy of Brad Ellsworth's record. And against Dan Coates, we saw that Brad's record got 45% of the vote, while Dan Coates got 55%. So when you have Congressman Donnelly ready to go across the state and try to put that record out, especially in a presidential year, 2 words: bring it. I'm ready for that.
Do you think that the attention on this primary race would help you as people get to know you a little more,
sure.
maybe? Or?
Sure. Oh, absolutely. It's, you know, when we started the race in January, actually February of last year, we'd done polling, and among Republicans, my negatives were margin of error, about 3%. Now, thanks to Mr. Lugar and all his ads, are about 23%, I'm told. But still, people know who I am. That's why this process is good. And I'm thrilled that now the presidential primary has passed. There is more of a national focus coming in on this race. I mean, we've had PBS, NPR, Wall Street Journal. Today I did Wall Street Journal, ABC News, CBS tomorrow, CNN tomorrow. I mean, this race, I really believe, is going to determine the heart and soul of the Republican Party in the U.S. Senate. It's either going to kind of stay where it's the good old boys club, or it's going to take more of a step towards the conservative side. And that's why we're seeing so many people from around the country as donors getting involved with this race. And let me preempt the question. Mr. Lugar says you're getting all that special interest money from all over the country. Yeah, I am. And I have a name for that special interest: conservatives. You know, they're looking at Mr. Lugar's record and realizing he's not representing the conservative wing of the party. And they want to send a message, number one, to help me, but also to send a message to other conservatives that these people are ready to come in and make a difference to send the country in a different direction.
Seems like, seems like with Rick Sands' forum, at least a large portion of the Republican Party has said no to ultra-conservatives or deeper conservatism and keeping Mitt Romney going. Do you see that, or is it?
Well, I think, you know, I do believe there was a lot of the anyone but Romney vote out there. When you add up all those total votes, I don't think there's been a single event yet when Mitt Romney got over 50%. I could be wrong on that, but I don't think that's the case. But, you know, the political process at that level is about much more than just philosophy. It is about who's got the money to get the message out. It's different than what is more of a grassroots campaign like we have even in a Senate race, and that's not purely grassroots, of course. But it's much more about how the messaging is done, how the marketing is done, and who's got the deepest of the deep pockets. So certainly that has played to Mr. Romney's advantage, and he was out there for a lot longer than anyone else. He did this once before. Perseverance in this business and having that sense of name ID and building on the base you built last time is always a good thing.
What do you feel about him?
You know, I haven't made any endorsements in the presidential side. I figure they're not gonna endorse me over Mr. Lugar, so I'll let somebody else make those endorsements. But whoever the candidate's gonna be, obviously I'm gonna support.
Would you talk a little bit about your views on, obviously you're an opponent of Obamacare. If Obamacare is not the solution, what do you think is?
Great question. First of all, we have to have a healthcare plan that is patient-centered and much more of a free market approach, a private sector competitive approach than what we have under Obamacare. I do believe Obamacare needs to be repealed. I have no idea.
100%?
Yeah.
Every portion of it?
Yeah, I would start over. And this is the basis I would start with. I would start with the idea that for seniors, and I'll borrow this from Paul Ryan's plan, there needs to be the so-called premium support for people on Medicare. And just to go on a slight sidestep here, I'm one who believes that both Medicare and Social Security, anybody over the age of 55 today, every promise that's been made to them must be kept. You know, I think that is a fundamental social contract between government and its citizens. And for those under, say, between 55 and 50 and 45 and 50 and 40 and 45, we need to put a different set of promises in front of those people. Because I don't think there's anything more immoral than government can do than lie to its own people. We don't have the resources to do what we're promising them, and let's change it. Back to healthcare. You know, I think we need a healthcare system that would allow insurance companies to work just like automobile companies across state lines to bring more competition in for health insurance. I think we need a healthcare system that would allow every one of us to deduct every penny of healthcare cost, including the cost of health insurance. We need to provide more in HSAs by opening up wider contribution limits in those areas. We also need, and having spent 31 years in the business sector, you measure, and I don't know what your measure is in the newspaper business, but somehow you measure productivity. It's how many dollars it costs to print a line inch. I don't know what your business is. You know, in our business, it used to be how many tons per man day of coal did you produce. I've had a chance over this campaign to spend a couple days working with doctors and just kind of, not really on rounds with them, but sort of close to that. And you watch them and they spend so much of their time filling out the coding for Medicare, Medicaid, for insurance companies under this new national standard. There are literally 144,000 potential codes that they have to apply to every single act of healing they provide. If you break a wrist, as many as 1,500 codes could apply. That sounds like arcane, okay, but who cares, right? It's just bureaucracy. Well, the problem is, at the end of the year, every doctor is audited by the Healthcare Savings Administration, or HSA. If they find out they're off 8%, they missed 8%, they have to give back 8% of the money, and likely will be charged with fraud. It is that kind of bureaucracy is so slowing down the practice of medicine. Instead of seeing 60 or 80 patients a day, the doctors are seeing 40. We need to be getting away from that kind of bureaucracy, building federal government mandated rules and coding so doctors can see more folks. The other thing that I think is absolutely abhorrent of Obamacare is this moves towards this national electronic data record system. The idea that all of our records for the most intimate parts of our lives, our healthcare, are going to be on a massive electronic system that supposedly no one can hack into, like that never happens. It's just wrong. It is fundamentally wrong, and it is especially wrong if we get to the point, if we keep Obamacare, if we keep that system, the electronic data records, at some point you're going to have some bureaucrat, when they start to ration healthcare, say, okay, let's see, who's coded 1101-C? Those people are null, and they're just going to start making the broad applications of government policy that I think strike at the very heart of what individual freedom is.
How do you handle the rising costs, though?
Everything I just said. Everything I just said. You know, there's only two areas of all of American life where new technology results in higher costs. Think about this. We're talking about your iPad. The price of iPads have gone down since it first came out. Cell phones come out and the prices come down. Technology always leads to lower cost, except in two areas. The Defense Department and healthcare. And why the healthcare and Defense Department? Because there's basically one person out there, one entity out ready to pay the bills, and that is the federal government. And there's never that sense of it's really somebody's money, it's always it's other people's money. And so there's a lot more waste out there, a lot more dollars, a lot more cost shifting going on under the federal mandates, and that's what's driving cost up. You know, part of it is just on the health insurance side.
So you're saying that with healthcare, the costs are solely being driven up by government
I didn't say solely, but
Okay.
certainly it is a major part of it. It is a major part, and it's not just that the costs are being driven up, Ryan, it's that the productivity is being driven down. Again, if running your newspaper, whatever the productivity gauge is, if you want to reduce your costs, you want to be more productive, you find some ways to allow people to do more given those 8 hours a day they work. And yet what we're doing is slowing down the practice of medicine with doctors and nurses and all the practitioners because they're spending so much time getting everything coded correctly, getting everything in this electronic data record system, and it is the most massive bureaucracy you can see. And it just isn't what we need to be doing in a healthcare system that should be more patient-centered. This is more service delivery-centered than patient-centered. We become a number as opposed to those old days when doctors were really looking after individual patients. You know, it's been alarming to me. I've met half a dozen doctors across the state in the last 6 months who are under the age of 55 who quit. They're saying, I'm done. I'm fed up with it. You know, I did my 13 years in medical school. I did all that, enjoyed it, but you know what? I'm just going to be a private consultant, and most of them end up being consultants for insurance companies, which is kind of frightening too as far as driving the cost up because they become expert witnesses in a sense. But they want to practice medicine. You know, I'm a science geek, okay, geologist. I love that science. Everybody that I've met who's a doctor didn't do it for the money. They didn't do it for, you know, any reason other than they love the physical part of the science and the healing. And they don't get to do that. And they're just saying, I'm done with it. You know, I'll let somebody else do it. I'll just take the knowledge I've gained and sit back and do something else because I don't want to fill out the damn forms. And it's really, it'd make a wonderful series for you. I'll put a challenge on the table. Just to have a couple of your reporters follow a few doctors around on just for a few days and to have a stopwatch there and just see how much of their day they actually spend doing healing. You'll be shocked. Absolutely shocked. It'd be a Pulitzer Prize-winning story, actually.
Richard, your opponent attempted to make an issue early in the campaign of your attendance at certain
I'm
meetings.
glad you asked.
Would you tell us about that?
I would be delighted. In fact, let me hit 3 issues that the present TV commercials deal with. Number 1, Mourdock only shows up at the meetings or doesn't show up 66% of the time. When I was sworn in and said, so help me God, at that moment, I was on 13 different boards and commissions. On most of those boards and commissions, I am not a voting member. When that board or commission was formed by the state legislature, it was given a budget, and they said, well, let's see, we need somebody to take care of the budget for that board or commission. Let's have the state treasurer do it. So they assigned the state treasurer. My first year in office, I made the rounds to all those meetings, spent the first 5 minutes in the meeting, was asked to give the treasurer's report, which is to say the treasurer of that committee's report. And you know, you read off how many assets, what the liabilities are, how much cash on hand, and then you sit there for 2 hours and you don't have a vote, you don't do anything else. I quickly determined that was a waste of my time as an elected official. And by the way, this is exactly the same practice as Governor Daniels and Lieutenant Governor Skillman and all the other statewide officials who find themselves on these various committees. And so the people who actually keep the books in our office for that board or commission, I assigned them by letter that they had the treasurer's duties on those boards and commissions. And this too is what the governor and lieutenant governors consistently do. On all the other boards where I am a voting member, without exception almost, I'm at those meetings. When you add up the meetings I've been to or my designee has been to, it is 99% attendance rate. So that is just an absolute attempt to try to make something out of nothing.